Muchísimas gracias, buenos días y muchas gracias por la invitación a hablar nuevamente en este ilustre evento. Y mis disculpas, pero mi español no es lo suficientemente bueno para hacer toda la presentación en español, entonces voy a hablar en inglés. Voy a share my screen, así podemos ver la presentación aquí, creo que puede funcionar, voilà. Y lo hago así.
Sí.
Pero bueno, si son pedidas, puedo intentar de hablar en castellano. So thank you very much again. It has been an incredible year for everybody in very many different ways. And I think our industry, our sector, the healthcare systems are the ones that have, in addition to the personal impact of COVID, have had to deal with trying to find solutions to COVID-19. And I, certainly in my lifetime, have never been confronted with this kind of emergency and this kind of situation. And there are many lessons that we have learned in dealing with the last few months that are very timely coming together with, as you mentioned, the development by the European Union of a new pharmaceutical strategy. And we hope very much that we can insert some of the lessons that we've learned, some of the best practices into the strategy before it's finalized at the end of this year. Maybe I can start with some lessons learned from dealing with COVID-19 in the innovative pharmaceutical industry. This is how we responded. As an innovative industry, there were 3 areas where we had to be immediately active. The first one is the middle one, is support, in fact. The very first area, and very few people are aware of it, in which our companies immediately acted was in supporting local healthcare systems. This went from monetary support to support in giving out, for example, personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, and other things that company had in stock, and in many, many other ways. It hasn't been seen, but it was very immediate and is continuous and very important, even to the extent that some of the doctors that are employed by our companies have actually gone and taken leave from work in the company and gone to work on the front line in hospitals and clinics. The second level, of course, was research, finding treatments and now vaccines that could help us combat COVID-19. This was also immediately set in place all over the world, also at European level. And not only were companies working on new compounds, but they were also scanning their libraries, and they have been scanning their libraries to see if any compound they had might be useful in the fight against COVID-19. What's also been very quick to happen is partnerships and working together. You may know that at European level, we have the largest public-private partnership on health in the world. It's called IMI, Innovative Medicines Initiative. Usually, it takes about a year to define a project, a partnering project, and for COVID, it took 2 months. And there were 180 projects that were already filed to get funding in the case of COVID-19. So you can see a very quick mobilization, an impressive effort on the part of industry, but also on the part of regulators to be able to facilitate that research and any other research that was being challenged. And then the third level, which was maybe the most challenging in terms of immediate impact, was the supply of medicines. So ensuring that medicines could continue to move across Europe at a time when countries were closing their borders, they were instituting export bans or similar measures for medicines. And as you know, no country in Europe is autonomous in the production of medicines. Even Europe itself is not autonomous. We have global supply chains. So as soon as you start closing borders to people who may work in one country and live in another, or to products, you get into a very serious situation and risks of shortages. Luckily, as far as our industry is concerned, our innovative products, there were no shortages despite the incredible challenges we had to face. We managed together with the institutions to ensure the supply of medicines, and I'm going to show you how this was done. For me, the real learning here is that there is a role for Europe in health. And this is not always recognized until today. Generally, health is a national prerogative, and for many right reasons, of course, to do with national budgets. But in this crisis, you really saw the value added of having a European Commission, European institutions that could help ensure, for example, the supply of medicines and personal protective equipment. As an industry, the first thing we did is come out with very clear commitments. I think this was important to be very clear about what we were doing and why we were doing it. And you don't want to read all 11 commitments here, but if you follow the wheel, you can see that it starts from the research side and the support side, and it goes over to ensuring that when we have treatments and vaccines available, they, or if you like, approved, they will be available and affordable for everything. And it was very important that we put this statement out there, because at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about, this is a global pandemic. How do we ensure maximum availability and affordability for everybody? And so this is a commitment that stands. This is our European commitment, but it matches the international one and the other regional ones as well. I think that's important to know. The way Europe organized itself to face COVID-19 was very impressive, I have to say. The main European commissioners that you can see there in the pictures on the left-hand side, so Thierry Breton, who's the Internal Market Commissioner, the Health Commissioner, Mrs. Kyriakides, and the Crisis Management Commissioner. Whoever thought that you would need a Crisis Management Commissioner was right in 2019. Had weekly calls with industry associations. So you can see a number of industry associations under there. And why did we have these weekly calls? We discussed every week very, very concrete issues. The borders are closed. How do we move? The trucks are stuck in long traffic jams. Medicines trucks as well. We need green corridors to make sure that our trucks don't get stuck at borders and keep moving. Workers can't move from one country to another. They need to go and work in the factories. How do they do that? Workers who work in pharmaceutical companies need to have protective equipment, personal protective equipment. They're not on the list of priority people to get that. How do we do that? And so it was really very concrete daily meetings, weekly meetings. There's a ban in this country. There's you can no longer export this material. How do we fix it? Together with these meetings at a commissioner level, we also had every week meetings with the European Medicines Agency and the national medicines agencies. And why was that important? It was to look on the regulatory side, not only to make sure that we were able to review those products that I mentioned before that may be useful for COVID-19 quickly enough and properly enough, but also that we were able to adapt the regulatory system to the new situations faced in COVID. For example, clinical trials. So when you're running clinical trials, you need patients to come to hospital very often. Suddenly, patients were not going to hospital anymore. So how do you run the clinical trial? You can't stop a clinical trial for 4 months. If you do that, you lose all the data and all the expertise you had. You basically have to start again. So we really worked again on a weekly basis with the medicines agencies to find the adaptation, the technical changes that needed to be done in order to make sure we could continue innovating in Europe, not just for COVID. And then vaccines, of course, and this is what we discuss mostly now in the media and the press, is about vaccine development and how do we manage to ensure that the companies in Europe have the right support to develop the vaccines? How do we distribute the vaccines? How do we produce enough vaccines? If it's only one company who's found it, can the other ones also manufacture the same product? What are the legal implications? What are the competition implications? So there we also have a continued dialogue. So this is why I said I think it was impressive and helpful that we had a European level to help. If you think about a country like the US, when they had border issues with Mexico or Canada, there is no supranational organization to help them deal with that. It had to be individual negotiations. We would have had to have the same 27 times. You can imagine how long that would take. In the meantime, people were getting very sick and dying. This is a very busy slide, and you don't need to look at it in detail, but you can see in the blue column the things that we were needed. So I mentioned the flow of goods and workers in the EU. On the 13th of March, we raised this issue in the weekly meeting, and that was a Friday. And you can see on the Monday, the 16th of March, we had the green corridors. The clinical trials on the 13th of March, we said we're having a problem, we can't do clinical trials. And on the 20th of March, we had new clinical trial guidance to allow for clinical trials to continue. So really you can see how quick this action was, because we were collaborating, because we were communicating directly. There was no online consultation. This was a dialogue, a very serious dialogue based on facts and trust. And I have to say that that is, I think, why we managed to make progress in Europe, despite, of course, it being a region that was and is very heavily hit and made up of 27 countries. Implications of COVID-19 for Europe. The challenges, of course, is that our healthcare systems will have suffered and are continuing to suffer. And so there will be pressure on the budgets. There will be considerations of reducing budgets, cost containment. The priorities of healthcare systems may change and may not change in the right way necessarily for there to continue to be innovative developments in Europe. There's a lot of European joint procurement going on. There's discussions around vaccines. You will have seen the contract the European Commission signed with AstraZeneca. This is challenging and different to the normal model that we deal with at European level, where each country can decide on their own. There's a lot of discussion about open strategic autonomy. There was fear about having to depend on other parts of the world to send us ingredients, because we import some active ingredients, but not for our industry, but mainly for the generic industry. Shifting R&D priorities, and then all the questions around vaccine development, as I mentioned before, manufacturing liability, allocation, price, a lot of new things that we need to develop to make sure that everything is done in the right time and way in order to meet the needs. On the other side, we have some opportunities. Like every time you have challenges, we have an opportunity really to look at health systems and reinvent them, to look at them with the reduced budgets that they will have, with the suffering that they will have, and say, okay, these are the weaknesses we saw during the pandemic. This is the budget we have today. These are the new opportunities in science and technology, both on the biology side and on the IT side. How can we optimize? How can we get the best outcomes for patients? How can we get the best interventions? How can we optimize expenditure? How can we be smarter in our healthcare systems? We've had to use digitalization during COVID. We noticed that we can't even compare mortality rates between countries because we count it differently. And that's the most basic outcome measurement ever. So although we use digitalization a lot more because we needed to inform each other where we were, how we were doing, we really also saw very clearly what we need to still fix in digitalization, how we can apply it to be more performant, but also what we need to move forward with. So European standards on data, on outcomes data, for example. We need to create more resilient global supply chains. We need to make sure that wherever a pandemic explodes, the rest of the world can cope and continue to have the supply of medicines it needs. There has been a lot of global regulatory alignment, or certainly there's an opportunity for that. You saw one part of the world, and you mentioned it in your roundtable just now, one part of the world approving a product, and then another part of the world saying, no, we don't think that's a good idea. And then, there is a need really in a globalized world where a pandemic like this is global, that we have much more global regulatory alignment. Decreasing the regulatory complexity, I mentioned that. We obtained that for many issues during COVID, like clinical trials, but also others. So it is possible, when you have to, it is possible. Without changing legislation, without going through a long process, it is possible to make some changes with guidelines that help decrease regulatory complexity, and then collaboration in R&D. So these are really the things the opportunities that came out, and the new areas that we can also work on that should be integrated in a pharmaceutical strategy looking forward for Europe. So if I put it on an escalera, in this vision, you can see that everything starts with research. So you need to have in Europe, as in every region of the world, a strong innovation ecosystem that allows Europe to continue to be strong in innovation and not just to be an importer of innovation. We are very involved, as you know, in the development of treatments and vaccines at a European level, and that puts us in a stronger position for when we need to decide how we'll be able to procure those vaccines and make sure that our population in Europe has the vaccines. If we were only a recipient of innovation, we would be in a very different geopolitical situation, and we can't underestimate the importance of having a strong innovation ecosystem. We need to strengthen our resilience in modern and secure manufacturing and supply. So you have the innovation, you need to be able to manufacture, and then you need to be able to make sure that you find the best access solutions. So it's not just about COVID, of course, it's about all our innovative medicines. There must be a better way to make sure that we increase access across Europe for innovative medicines. And we as an industry believe we can do that together. We do it together for COVID, we must be able to do it together for other innovative medicines as well. And then, of course, this is a new thing that maybe we hadn't thought about before. Make sure that Europe is prepared for any future serious health threats. So what are the lessons learned in COVID that we can make sure we don't make those mistakes again? And underlying that, of course, is the digital transformation that needs to happen to make sure that we are as effective and efficient as possible in dealing with pandemics and the economic recovery that we are all now busy with in one way or another. I just have a couple of slides here on the European pharmaceutical strategy. You can see these are the building blocks for us of a successful and innovative Europe for the future, one that is resilient and able to cater for the citizens of Europe. Does the European pharmaceutical strategy, the draft that we have at the moment, support these goals? At the moment, it's very focused, the draft is very focused on this orange part, the ensuring patients across Europe get access to safe supply of affordable medicines. But as I mentioned before, if we are not a world leader in medical innovation, we will be an importer of products. So the strategy needs to look at both sides, needs to make sure that our industry is also supported as a world leader in medical innovation. There is a lot of competition going on for medical innovation, as you know. The US has been long one of our biggest rivals, and for the last 25 years, they have been the leader in medical innovation, whereas 25 years ago, we were leaders in medical innovation. And now more and more, Asia, especially China, is emerging as an area with very strong incentives for our companies to innovate. And why is it important? Innovation is not just innovation, it's also clinical trials. So of course, when you are developing new products, you're also testing them, and patients get access earlier, even through these clinical trials. So innovation is an ecosystem. It's not just industry. It's to do with universities. It's to do with SMEs. It's to do with technology transfer offices. And it's also to do with patients around that. So I think that it's very important that the pharmaceutical strategy at European level really looks at both the goals that were set to the Commissioner when she started and doesn't forget one, because it's a cycle. It's a circle. It's a virtuous circle. If you only have one side, you become very vulnerable and dependent on the rest of the world. So this is really, I think it's my last slide. The lessons from COVID-19 for the pharmaceutical strategy. I think we can't deny that medical innovation is the answer. Whether we're looking at treatments, old treatments that we try to repurpose for COVID-19, or now that we're looking for a vaccine, without innovation, we will never get anywhere. And I think that this is hopefully a message that has come out strongly. Innovation is always underestimated or under-considered. It just happens somewhere. But in fact, you really need the right incentives and the right environment, the right ecosystem to allow medical innovation. You need those universities, you need those SMEs, you need all the structure of medical research centers, and you need a facility to be able to collaborate like IMI, but also on national levels. And you need priority to be given to R&D. And that's always when you're looking at a national budget, often research and development is maybe not the first consideration that you have. Resilience begins with research. So as I mentioned, if you are just a recipient of innovation, you are in a difficult geopolitical situation because you are dependent on the innovation that will be or will not be shared by other parts of the world. You want to be in the race, you want to be in the game, you want to be able also to partner with other parts of the world so that you can improve your outcomes. Access is a shared goal, and you can find shared solutions. We're learning that in COVID. It's different. We're doing it differently. You can see these contracts between companies and the Commission. It's not to say that this is the way to go, but what I see specifically is that there are conversations, there are discussions, there are places where we can talk about access and how to ensure access. And that's the very first time. Usually access is a discussion that happens between one company, one country, or even one region about one product. And here we're looking more broadly and being more creative. And I think this is something that we should not lose when we come out of COVID and we look at the pharmaceutical strategy. And then, yeah, the policy that we develop now is really the future of our health. So whatever we decide now, I hope that health is wealth, so that the concept that, you know, investing in health is important for the economy. I hope that, unfortunately, this is one of the learnings from COVID-19. I would say before COVID, yeah, you could invest in roads and other things. I hope that now it's clear that without health, you don't have anything. Without health, you don't have anything. And so the pharmaceutical strategy that is being developed is extremely important for our future in general, not just for the health aspects. So yeah, I know I went rather quickly because I wanted to leave some time for questions if there are any, but this is really in a nutshell the things that we have learned from our experience. We're still in it, unfortunately, and my heart goes out to you in Spain because I know that the situation is quite difficult right now. So we're still in it. Hopefully we don't make the same mistakes we did in the spring when countries were closing borders, when they were banning exports of medicines, when they were doing similar things. Hopefully we have a little bit more solidarity among member states now and some learnings, and we can be better equipped for now and for the future. So I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, José. Voilà.
Muchas gracias, Nathalie. Thank you very much. Mientras los oyentes se animan a presentar alguna pregunta, que me parece que todavía no tenemos, pero yo sí tengo una pregunta para Nathalie. Se la voy a hacer en inglés si le resulta más fácil.
No, para mí, yo lo entiendo, pero no lo hablo bastante bien.
Entonces en español, estupendo. Buena oportunidad para hablar español. La pregunta es la siguiente. Ha mencionado la estrategia europea de vacunas. También la directora de la agencia ha hablado de los logros que está teniendo esta estrategia europea y lo importante que es la cooperación que está teniendo lugar, cooperación entre países y también cooperación entre la industria y los gobiernos. Esto por un lado. Tenemos el acuerdo firmado con AstraZeneca y otros acuerdos que están en camino. Pero hace pocos días el Economist publicaba un editorial en el que opinaba que el esfuerzo que se está haciendo todavía es pequeño. El esfuerzo para invertir en la investigación, el desarrollo y la fabricación de vacunas, que todavía era pequeño, que el esfuerzo todavía tenía que ser mayor. Me gustaría saber su opinión entonces en relación con este tema tan importante.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think that there are more than 138 vaccine projects underway. So I don't think that's a small number. I think that's a very big number, in fact, for an area that maybe had 2 or 3 before the pandemic exploded, because there were already some studies around this particular disease. So I don't think the investment is small. I don't think the research effort is small at all. What I do know is that scientifically it is a very complex area to be looking into, and that, of course, the extreme urgency with which companies have to work is unprecedented. So it's true, of course, we did work on Ebola, you will remember that, or on SARS, but the outbursts were quite contained in a number of countries, and it wasn't a global pandemic in that sense. It was contained. And even there, a vaccine for Ebola took 4 years to finally be found. Right now, the pressure is on to come with something as soon as possible, within 2 years, 1.5 years, 1 year if possible. So I think the efforts are enormous that companies are putting in. I'm seeing the openness also to consider manufacturing other companies' vaccines when and if the vaccine comes, which is also, a very new approach by the industry. So as far as I can see, also watching the weekly interactions between the CEOs of the vaccine companies, this is all out. All the efforts are there. Everything that we can put on the table, we're putting on the table. You will have seen that the COVAX facility that was mentioned also in the news recently, which is about ensuring that the vaccines also reach low and middle income countries, has now been joined also by the European Commission, but the industry has been a member of that for a long time. So everywhere where we can, we are, but mostly in the laboratory. So I think that we really can't do more than what we're doing today. We just have to make sure that everybody is playing their part, and that we get something as quickly as possible, but in following the right regulatory procedures so that we can be confident about the product.
Muchas gracias. Sí que tenemos ahora una pregunta por el chat y se interesa un oyente por su opinión acerca de cuáles pueden ser los puntos de la legislación europea que podrían cambiar en el futuro, teniendo en cuenta la nueva estrategia y las enseñanzas de la pandemia. Usted ha expuesto efectivamente enseñanzas de la pandemia. Esta persona, este alumno, nos pregunta en qué puntos más importantes podría cambiar la legislación europea.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we've been looking into this also very carefully because, of course, the legislation is 20 years old and the technology has gone quite developed in the last 20 years. And what we've seen and what we've proposed is adaptations of the legislation without necessarily changing the legislation, because if you change, it takes about 5 years. You have to go through all the decision process at European level, where you have a proposal, you go to Parliament, to Council, etc. The way we saw it, for example, and the learnings from COVID are that you can adapt the legislation without changing it. So through guidelines or through other ways, there are fast and predictable ways of changing the legislation to have the outcome you want. Legislative change is not predictable. So there's a draft text and then it goes to the Parliament, etc., and it comes back in a very unpredictable way, content-wise and time-wise. The areas that we were proposing since the very beginning were the inclusion of real-world data into dossiers, into approval dossiers. More and more products are for smaller populations, and which we propose also to follow after, so to have a post-market monitoring and collection of real-world evidence. How can we include this real-world evidence in the dossiers and in the system? And at the moment, there is not a lot of flexibility. It's still the very typical clinical trials that are required for approval, and we have some suggestions there. Also, some suggestions around complex clinical trials. So again, if you look at these new products that are very particular, advanced therapies or others, the clinical trial designs are very different from what your classic clinical trial is. If you have a very small population, you again have a very different setting. How can you make sure that you can adapt to complex clinical trials, and probably a regulatory process that evolves with the dossier? And it's very difficult. It's a very new kind of way of dealing with the regulatory approval of a product, but other regions are also implementing it. You will have seen in the US and in Japan. So we can, I think, learn from those parts of the world and adapt safely also our regulatory system. But we don't think that changing the framework is at the moment the right way to go, because as soon as you change a legislative framework, of course, of such a big, I think it's 12 pieces of legislation, you also risk de-incentivizing research and development in Europe, because as a region, then it seems a bit unstable and unpredictable, and yeah, companies don't like unpredictability. They have other regions with very stable regulatory frameworks, and they might be more attracted to apply first in those regions than in Europe.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a Nathalie Moll por su participación, por su muy interesante conferencia, por sus amables respuestas a las preguntas que les hemos formulado. Esperamos poderla recibir personalmente en próximos años en este encuentro y como hicimos hace 2 años en el Palacio de la Magdalena. Muchísimas gracias, Nathalie, por su participación.
Gracias a vosotros y un buen día, una buena continuación. Adiós, gracias.
Adiós, muchas gracias. Con esto terminamos.